This is called Blessed Be Your Name.
Blessed be your name in the land that is plentiful, where your streams of abundance flow. Blessed be your name, and blessed be your name when I'm found in the desert place, though I walk through the wilderness. Blessed be your name. Every blessing you pour out, I'll turn back to praise. When the darkness closes in, Lord, still I will say, blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your glorious name. And blessed be your name when the sun's shining down on me, when the world's all as it should be. Blessed be your name. And blessed be your name on the road marked with suffering, though there's pain in the offering. Blessed be your name. Every blessing you pour out, I'll turn back to praise. When the darkness closes in, Lord, still I will say, blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your glorious name. You give and take away. You give and take away. My heart will choose to say, Lord, blessed be your name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your glorious name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your glorious name. You give and take away. You give and take away. But my heart will choose to say, blessed be your name. You give and take away. You give and take away. But my heart will choose to say, oh, blessed be your name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your glorious name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your
What does it take to turn someone into a Judas? What motivates someone to betray deep-seated loyalties? Unresolved anger and resentment, for one thing. Greed may also play a part. Consider the story of Earl Pitts, FBI agent turned Soviet spy. Pitts was raised on a farm in Missouri and was recognized as a future farmer of America. His parents said that they disciplined him firmly, but fairly. He was a captain in the Army who regarded himself as a patriot. Even today, he is described by his wife as a good man. So what happened? After getting his law degree and serving as a military policeman for 6 years, in 1983, Pitts realized a lifelong ambition by going to work for the FBI. In 1987, he was assigned to the New York office, and there his troubles began. He did not see how he could afford to live in the Big Apple on his $25,000 a year salary. Morale in his office was poor, and petty cheating on expense accounts was rampant. Burdened with debt from student loans, Pitts had to ask his dad for a loan. He felt humiliated. Pitts later told a psychiatrist that he was overwhelmed by a sense of rage at the FBI. One morning he came up with the idea of spying for the KGB. That way he could kill two birds with one stone. He could solve his money problems and get back at his bosses. Later he told a psychiatrist, "I was shoved by the bureaucracy, and I shoved back." Over the next 7 years, Pitts worked as a Soviet spy and for his services received $224,000. When he was finally caught and convicted, the judge sentenced him to 27 years in prison. After sentencing, the judge asked him point blank why he had become a traitor. Earl Pitts replied, "I gave in to an unreasonable anger." Now, anger may have been part of the motivation behind Judas' betrayal of Jesus, but certainly love of money was part of his decision to betray Jesus. I think it is easy to condemn Judas for his behavior without recognizing that we also betray Jesus whenever we choose to sin. I believe that any time we compromise our faith in Jesus Christ to engage in worldly behavior, we betray Jesus. Today we are going to look at the betrayal of Jesus in Matthew chapter 26, verses 14 through 16. In this passage, we will see first the motivation for the betrayal in verse 14, the reward for betrayal in verse 15, and the result of the betrayal in verse 16. Let's take a look at the passage. This is Matthew chapter 26, verse 14. Then one of the 12, whose name was Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priest and said, "What will you give me if I deliver him over to you?" And they paid him 30 pieces of silver. And from that moment, he sought an opportunity to betray him. Now, in verse 14, we're going to see the reason for betrayal. Now, when law enforcement has a suspect for a crime, they often look to see if the suspect had motive, opportunity, and means. And in verse 14, we're going to take a look at Judas' motivation for betrayal, his opportunity for betrayal, and the means he had at hand for betrayal. First of all, let's look at his motivation. The obvious motive for Judas' betrayal of Jesus was monetary. When seeking to betray Jesus, Judas asked the high priest, and you can see it in verse 14, verse 15, "What will you give me to deliver him over to you?" So he was motivated, obviously, by money. He wanted that money, and they agreed on 30 pieces of silver. The Apostle John also gives us some insight into Judas's character. In John's Gospel, in chapter 12, he tells us that Judas was the disciples' treasurer carrying the communal purse. In verse 6, John tells us, this is chapter 12, verse 6, John tells us that Judas was a thief, and having charge of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. In other words, he was stealing from the disciples, from Jesus and the disciples. When people gave them money, he would often skim off a part of that. Maybe he thought of it as his salary. I don't know. But I believe that there might have been another motivation, anger. You see, Judas had joined the disciples, like the other disciples, hoping that Jesus was going to be the conquering king described in the Old Testament. I believe that Judas was hoping to be one of those people who was closest to Jesus, so that when Jesus came to power, when he declared himself to be the Messiah, that Judas would be able to exploit that relationship with Jesus for power and more money. But when Jesus began to talk about being arrested and beaten and crucified, and he did it 4 times in the Gospel of Matthew, I believe that Judas began to feel betrayed by Jesus. He had had expectations of Jesus, and Jesus had not come through for him. And that wasn't what he signed up for. You see, I think Judas had mixed motive. He was greedy for money. He was angry with Jesus, that Jesus had not done what he expected, and he was eager to see that if he betrayed Jesus, would Jesus proclaim himself to be Messiah and save himself? You see, I believe that we betray Jesus whenever we turn to the world to meet our needs instead of turning to God to provide for us. And what would our motives be for betraying Jesus? Like Judas, I think that our motive may be mixed. We may be tempted by the world to meet our need for security through the making and saving of money. Now, there's nothing wrong with making money and saving money, but when it becomes more important to us than God, it takes the place of God, and we are betraying Jesus by making money and saving money our idol. Or consider the fact that we need intimate relationships. Now, God provides for us, for many of us, through marriage. But the world tempts us with the offers of intimate relationships that are condemned by the Word of God. So when we give into those temptations and we engage in intimate relationships that are condemned by God, we are betraying Jesus and putting intimate sexual relationships in the place of God and betraying Jesus. Now, we also see in verse 14 that there was an opportunity. There was means, now we're looking at opportunity. The opportunity was that he left the fellowship. If you take a look at verse 14, at the end of the verse it says, Judas Iscariot went to the chief priests. Now, Jesus and the disciples didn't all go to the chief priest. It was Judas that went to see the chief priest. The disciples stayed behind in the upper room with Jesus. But Judas left the fellowship and went to the high priest. What was the opportunity that Judas made to betray Jesus? Verse 14 tells us he left the disciples to go to the chief priest. But what Matthew implies, the Gospel of John spells out for us. In John chapter 13, Jesus and the disciples are celebrating the Passover in the upper room when Jesus shocks the disciples with the news that someone is going to betray him. They are all just amazed, and so they begin to ask who it might be. And Jesus indicates that the one to whom he gives the morsel of bread is the one who will betray him. And he gives the morsel to Judas. And the gospel says, and I'm quoting, then after he had taken the morsel, Satan entered into him, that is Judas, and Jesus said to Judas, what you are going to do, do quickly. So after receiving the morsel of bread, Judas went out, and it was night. The point of all of this is that what gave Judas the opportunity to sin and betray Jesus was the leaving of the fellowship of Jesus and the disciples. You see, there's a certain amount of accountability when we're with other believers, when we're with Jesus in the presence of other believers. Other believers can say, hey, that might not be a good idea. You might not want to do that. But Judas left the fellowship to go and commit his sin and commit betrayal. So how does this apply to us? Well, we give into temptation and betray Jesus much more easily when we are out of the fellowship of other believers. And that is why the writer of Hebrews says this, and I'm quoting, and let us consider how to stir one another up to love and good deeds, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another. You see, the writer of Hebrews knew that when we get together, when we fellowship, when we talk about Jesus and what Jesus is doing in our life, there's a certain amount of accountability. It's much more difficult for us to give in to temptation and betray Jesus through sin when we're fellowshipping with other believers. We are much more vulnerable to temptation when we are not taking advantage of fellowship. And what was the means? See, we've taken a look at the opportunity and the method, and now we're taking a look at the means. The means was that Jesus sought out Jesus' enemies. The means of betraying Jesus was to go to his enemies. We saw in the last chapter that the chief priest was going to wait until after the Passover, to arrest Jesus and kill him, because they were afraid, because the crowds liked Jesus and had been following him, they were afraid that there might be a riot in defense of Jesus. But when Judas went to them and offered to guide them to where Jesus was secretly staying, they decided it was worth the risk to arrest Jesus before the Passover. Judas knew that the chief priest would highly prize the information about where Jesus was staying and would likely pay for it. When we leave the fellowship of Jesus and other believers and we seek out Jesus' enemies, we will in all likelihood betray him. Let me give you a couple examples. If an alcoholic goes to a bar, he is there where the enemy of Jesus is. For that man, for that woman, the alcohol is the enemy because it's a temptation. And by going where it is, he's giving in to the temptation. And consider this possibility. If one were to cultivate a friendship, a relationship with a coworker whom he or she finds physically attractive, then that person is seeking out the opportunity where betrayal is almost a foregone conclusion. Now in verse 15, we're going to see the reward for betrayal. In verse 15, we see the reward for betrayal and the suggestion of a rationalization. Take a look at verse 15. And said, "What will you give me if I deliver him over to you?" And they paid him 30 pieces of silver. Now notice that first of all, there's a reversal of values. Up until this time, Judas has been following Jesus. He's been spending a lot of time with Jesus. He's been obeying Jesus. When Jesus made a command, he would obey. But now he's going to give over Jesus for his desires, for his desires for money. So Jesus becomes less important and money becomes more important. He's reversed his values. Later, when Judas realizes that Jesus is going to be crucified, he takes the money back to the high priest and he begs him to take the money back and give Jesus and free Jesus. But the high priest will have nothing to do with that because he wants to kill Jesus. And so Judas, in frustration, throws the money into the temple and then goes and hangs himself. This is the result of reversing our values. When we take Jesus off of the top and put our fleshly desires on top, we reverse the values. We always sin and betray Jesus because sin offers us some reward, money or pleasure or renown, but the ultimate reward of sin and betrayal is guilt and some kind of death. Now, you might be asking yourself, how could Judas do such a thing? And I want to suggest to you that the reason he could convince himself to go do this, to reverse his values, take Jesus off the top and put money on the top, was that he rationalized. I think it went something like this. I believe that he thought that by betraying Jesus, he would force Jesus to proclaim himself to be Messiah and make himself king of Israel and then go conquer his enemies. This rationalization, he just could not understand how Jesus would take that opportunity, pass up that opportunity to rule, and instead go to the cross and die. And so he believed that he rationalized to himself that if he did this, it would be a good thing overall. Whenever we sin, we usually find some kind of rationalization to sin. It's not that bad a sin, after all. It's just a little white lie. It's not a big lie. Or we might say to ourselves, I will commit this sin and then I will ask God to forgive me. He loves me. He will always forgive me. But you see, whenever we choose to sin, the result is guilt and the death of some kind. It might be a physical death. It might just be the death of trust or the death of a relationship. Certainly, it will damage the fellowship that we have with God and other believers. So whenever we sin, we tend to rationalize just the way Judas did. Now in verse 16, we're going to see the result of betrayal. Betraying Jesus by choosing to sin can never end well. Take a look at verse 16. And from that moment, he sought an opportunity to betray him. And you see what happens here? Up until this time, Judas has been following Jesus. He's been listening to his teachings. He's been seeing the miracles. He's been impressed by the miracles. But now, instead of listening to Jesus and watching what Jesus does, he's seeking an opportunity. The sin has filled his mind. The desire for that 30 pieces of silver has so filled his mind that he can't hear what Jesus has to say. Sure, there was a pretense of fellowship. When Jesus went to betray Jesus, he betrayed him with a kiss. He was acting as if there was nothing wrong, even though he was betraying Jesus. But you can't fool Jesus. Jesus knows when you've betrayed him. You may fool your spouse. You might fool the people in the church. But when you're betraying Jesus by choosing to sin, you can't fool him. He knows your heart. He knows what you're doing. And you can't fool Jesus. When we have a mind to betray Jesus by sinning, we may fool others, but we can't fool Jesus. Our mind becomes so filled with the idea, with the reward of sin, that we can't hear what Jesus has to say anymore. Now, we don't see it in this passage. In chapter 26, verse 16, it says, and from that moment he sought an opportunity to betray him. But when he eventually did betray Jesus, in chapter 27, it says that Judas took the money back to the chief priests, and when the chief priests refused to take the money back, he threw it into the temple and went out and hanged himself. His betrayal of Jesus led to his physical death. Now, when we choose to sin, it's not always going to lead to a physical death, but it always leads to some kind of death. The Apostle Paul wrote in Romans chapter 3, verse 23, that the wages of sin is death. Whenever we sin, we get paid back by some kind of death. Lying, for instance, we may kill a friendship or the trust of a mate, or any kind of sin will bring about a temporary damaging of our fellowship with God. That's a kind of death. Judas' death in chapter 27 is just a reminder of the fact that choosing to betray Jesus by sinning is choosing guilt and death. Years ago, a San Diego bank hired a private investigator to track down a bank robber and retrieve stolen funds. The search led to Mexico. The investigator crossed the border and then, realizing he would need a Spanish interpreter, opened up a telephone book and hired the first interpreter listed in the Yellow Pages. After many days, he finally captured the bandit and through the interpreter asked him, "Where did you hide the money?" In Spanish, the thief replied, "What money? I have no idea what you're talking about." With that, the investigator drew his pistol, pointed it at the suspect, and said to the interpreter, "Tell him that if he doesn't tell me where the money is, I will shoot him where he stands." Upon receiving this message, the bank robber said to the interpreter, "Senor, I have hidden the money in a coffee can under the fourth board in the second floor men's room of the Palacio Hotel on the Via del Rio in La Paz." "What did he say?" asked the investigator of the interpreter. "Senor," said the interpreter as he thought for a moment, "he says that he is prepared to die like a man." Obviously, the interpreter didn't value the bank robber's life as much as he valued the money, and so he was quite willing to betray the bank robber for the money. Judas betrayed Jesus because he didn't value his master as much as he valued the 30 pieces of silver. Jesus had much more value than 30 pieces of silver, but Judas couldn't see it. He was so blinded by his betrayal. And whenever we choose to sin, we are blinded too. we are choosing sin, which leads to guilt and death, and we're betraying our Savior.
Hello. During these uncertain times, this song seems to be very apropos. It's called Lord, I Need You. Lord, I come, I confess, bowing here, I find my rest. Without you, I fall apart. You're the one that guides my heart. Lord, I need you. Oh, I need you. Every hour I need you. My one defense, my righteousness. Oh God, how I need you. Where sin runs deep, your grace is more. Where grace is found is where you are. Where you are, Lord, I am free. Holiness is Christ in me. Lord, I need you. Oh, I need you. Every hour I need you. My one defense, my righteousness. Oh God, how I need you. So teach my song to rise to you. When temptation comes my way, when I cannot stand, I'll fall on you. Jesus, you're my hope and stay. Lord, I need you. Oh, I need you. Every hour I need you. My one defense, my righteousness. Oh God, how I need you. You're my one defense, my righteousness. Oh God, how I need you. My one defense, my righteousness. Oh God, how